The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
Hello and welcome to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and on today's episode, we'll be talking about the nature of time. A little later on, Rachelle Saunders will speak to theoretical astrophysicist Ethan Siegel about the possibility of time travel. But first, let's take a look at the fascinating research into how we perceive time. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm joined today by Claudia Hammond. Claudia has presented numerous programs on BBC Radio 4, including All in the Mind and Mind Changers. As a psychologist, she's passionate about communicating what psychological research has to teach us, whether that's through radio, writing, appearing on TV programs, or lecturing in health psychology for Boston University's base in London. She's the author of Time Warped: Unlocking the Mysteries of Time Perception. Welcome to the show, Claudia.
Thanks for having me.
Now, how did you get interested in the nature of time?
Well, I got interested in it because initially I wrote a book about emotions before, and I looked at all this research on emotions from all around the world, and I just started noticing that in a lot of these papers and experiments, there seemed to be some element where our subjective experience of time passing seemed to be influenced by people's emotions, and that got me interested in looking at time. And then I found that there had been all sorts of extraordinary studies done all around the world, and I'm not looking at time as it passes, time as in physics and the actual time that's measurable that's out there, but more about our subjective experience of time and why it is that 20 minutes when you're on a railway platform waiting for a train and you're late and it's raining and it's cold, that will feel like a very, very long 20 minutes. But if you have just 20 minutes in which to grab a sandwich at lunchtime and talk to a friend you've not seen for ages, you'll look at your watch and in no time at all that 20 minutes is up and you've got to go to work again. So how can the same minutes feel so different is what I'm interested in.
Well, throughout the book, you mention a number of studies that attempt to research our perception of time. But what's your sense of the field as a whole? Is there a substantial amount of data for you to pull from, or is this field fairly new?
There are lots of experiments that have been done. I mean, there's still lots of questions that haven't been able to be answered yet, but there are lots of experiments. But what's interesting is that they come from quite different fields within psychology and neuroscience. So memory is one of the things that has a lot to do with time perception, and there are lots and lots of people studying different aspects of our memory. And then there are different people who are studying how we think about the future, how we hold ideas of the future in mind. And then there are lots of neuroscientists who are studying the mechanisms, if you like, trying to find, is there a single clock in the brain, and how is it that we're able to distinguish milliseconds from seconds and minutes and hours, and even guessing something like an hour passing. We're fairly good at it, and how is it that we're doing that? So a lot of different fields are looking at this area and coming to it from different ways.
Well, time is definitely one of those topics that can veer towards the philosophical as opposed to the scientific. And that's mainly because it does appear to be so subjective. So what were you looking for in the research that you chose to use in the book?
I was very much looking for ways people have found of testing something that seems so subjective, but of finding a systematic way of doing that to try and work out what it is that's going on in our minds. And in one way, it's quite straightforward that if you get people to estimate a minute passing and then you time that on a stopwatch, you can tell whether the time seems to be going fast or slowly for that individual at that moment. And it's very easy and straightforward to affect that and make it different. So there's an experiment I really like that an American psychologist, Jean Twenge, did, where it's quite a mean experiment, where she got a load of people in a room and got them all to mingle and chat to each other and get to know each other, talk about their favourite music and where they'd been on holiday. And they were all wearing name badges. And then they were told they were going to be working in pairs, and so it would be good if they could put down the name of a couple of people they'd most like to work with. And then they called them into a room one at a time. And with half the people, this is where the mean bit comes in, they told them that this had never happened before, but nobody put them down, and that this was really extraordinary and really unusual, and that nobody wanted to work with them. And the experimenter would shift sort of rather uncomfortably in her chair as she told them this. With the other half of the people, they told them that they'd never had this happen before, but amazingly, every single person in the room had put them down, and that they'd never known anyone so popular, and that it would be fairer if they just worked on their own. So they end up with all these people in different rooms on their own, half of them feeling really rejected and sad, wondering why it is everyone hates them and this whole room full of strangers doesn't like them. And the others thinking, gosh, aren't I popular and nice? Isn't that lovely? And the test that they gave them to do was this very straightforward test of time perception, of estimating a minute passing. And they found that for the people who were feeling rejected, time actually felt subjectively to them as if it was going more slowly than for the people for whom time was going fast. So they'd actually begun to focus in on themselves and why people didn't like them. And this had actually slowed down their perception of time.
So emotion obviously affects how we experience time then.
That's right. Emotion is one of the key things that affects our experience of time. And a lot of people will have had the experience of a situation where they were really terrified and really felt their life was in danger. And in that situation, people will very commonly describe that time slows right down. And I mean, I was in a car accident myself that could only have taken, I don't know, 10 or 20 seconds, but I can remember what felt like every minute of it, and it felt so much longer than that, and I remember thinking about so many things during that time, and many people will say this, and one of the reasons is that we know that emotions create very strong memories, and so if emotions are very, very strong, they etch stronger memories into our minds. And as soon as that event is finished, we judge how long something's taken by how many new memories we made, and you're going to remember every single thing about that accident, and then you assume it took longer than it did. But also, fear narrows our focus, and it makes us pay attention to the things that might save us. So you stop paying attention to some of the markers of time which might tell you how much time is passing, like the song changing on the radio or how many buildings you pass, because instead you're going to focus on, is there anything I can do in this car to try and save myself? And that's why fear seems to slow time down.
Now, can you talk about some of the research that supports that idea?
I mean, they've tried to do extraordinary experiments that David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, has done, where he has dropped people backwards off a very high tower, so a kind of thing you get at a fun fair, which, you know, some people will pay for and think is fun. I don't, but some people will. He catches them at the bottom, I should stress. So they're dropped in a kind of cage and they fall backwards. It's like falling backwards off a building, and it's completely terrifying. In fact, David Eagleman bravely tried it out himself, and he said he did it 3 times and thought that by the 3rd time he'd be used to it, but it was still what he called beyond scary. And so he found that doing it forwards wasn't scary enough. He had to do it backwards. And then as they fell, he had them watching a great big counter where numbers flicked very fast, too fast for us to normally perceive. And he was wondering whether the brain is actually processing information faster during that time. And and he was wondering if this is why time feels as if it slows down. So as they fell, they looked at this, and he wanted to know if they could see what was going on and what was flicking. Very occasionally they could, but mostly they couldn't, and really the conclusion is that they can't. And so it's not that the brain is actually processing information faster, but it is that we're able to think faster about those things. And so people will often talk about this focus that they had when something like that happened, that they were able to think faster than ever before. And actually that's because your attention is so focused. So it's actually attention that's making the difference rather than your brain actually processing faster. But one of the theories is that what we're doing is counting up emotional moments, if you like, and that this is how we judge how much time has passed. And there's a researcher called Bud Craig who has this theory of emotional moments, and he thinks that what we're doing is counting time by almost registering a series of how am I feeling questions, and then how am I feeling now, terrified, how am I feeling now, terrified, and that the more of those moments we register, the more times we ask ourselves those questions, the more time will seem to slow down, because it's almost like if you were counting sheep going through a gate, that there's more and more of them going through, all these moments are going through, and in total that makes it seem like more time has passed. In other words, it went more slowly. That's one of the theories about how our brains might be counting time, because what's amazing is nobody can find a single clock in the brain that's doing it.
This is Science for the People, and I'm talking to psychologist Claudia Hammond, who presents All in the Mind and Mind Changers on BBC Radio 4. Okay, so you mentioned the idea of counting moments, and that's one theory, but there's a number of theories, are there not?
Yes, there's lots, but because there's this mystery that nobody can find a single clock. I mean, you can try to look at different brain injuries that people have had, and there's no single brain injury to a single area, which means you lose all sense of time perception, which is unusual in a way. But what there is that different areas of the brain seem to make different durations of time difficult to count up. So some people, if they have an injury in a particular area, will lose the ability to judge milliseconds. Other people might have an injury in a different area and lose the ability to judge durations of about 2 seconds or more. And so nobody can find a single clock. So then that raises the question, perhaps there's a series of clocks, and perhaps there's a series of clocks that work for different durations. But again, nobody can find these actual clocks. So some people think, so David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, he thinks that we count packets of energy, and that in a sense we're counting up how much neural energy we've used to do a certain thing. So when you're in a terrifying situation, you're concentrating very, very hard, you're using up a lot of neural energy, and that you're counting that up, and so it makes it seem as if lots of time went past. Others have theories about, Dean Buonmano has an interesting theory where he describes time as ripples, and he thinks that these ripples sort of come out and we count the changes in the ripples, and that's how we work out how much time has passed. But another idea is that we're just counting something else that the brain is doing, we're counting up some other activity, some pulses that are being used for something else, which could be anything. It could be, we don't know, it could be recognizing faces or coming up with memories or anything that we're doing, and that we're just counting up the activity that's already going on in the brain.
Well, which theory has the most evidence behind it?
I personally I like this idea that we're using something else, because I think it's almost an absence of evidence, because no one can find where this clock is, or a specific mechanism, or we haven't found any way of detecting these time pulses. There's not some nice counter that's counting, and originally people thought there might be a simple clock counter, and then that's counting beats, and then an accumulator, if you like, that's counting up those beats. But we can't find those. So it's almost an absence of evidence, if you like, that would lead me to favour at the moment the idea that we're counting up something else that our brain is doing.
Well, I've always wondered if we actually do need an outside source to tell us what time it is, or if it's something innate, because what with circadian rhythms and all, it feels like it might be something innate.
Yes, I mean, the one clock we do know there is, obviously, is the body clock, but that only dictates our 24-hour cycle, and that uses light in order to do that, and daylight, which is why if people are underground, say, or haven't got a daylight, they very quickly become disorientated and lose that time, because we run at slightly more than 24 hours, and so you can very quickly get out of time, because our natural clock can't do that without daylight to reset it every day. And so we know there is that body clock, but that doesn't seem to have anything to do with us being able to judge these other different durations of time. But what I think is fascinating is when you look at people with different sorts of conditions. And so children with Tourette's syndrome, for example, are better than other children at judging durations of just over a second. So Tourette's is when the children have the tics that are difficult to control. And particularly the children who are good at controlling these tics are particularly good at judging these durations of just over a second. And this suggests that the prefrontal cortex is involved. So this is at the very front of the head, right behind the forehead. And in the children that are good at controlling tics, they have to use the prefrontal cortex. It becomes very active for them to be able to do that. And if they're very good at suppressing those tics, they also become good at time estimation for those 2 seconds, which suggests that the prefrontal cortex is the area for that. And people with Parkinson's disease find these 2 seconds very difficult. And so there are all these conditions which can give us ideas of where things are happening, but it does seem to be lots of different places. And I mean, you can do experiments like with transmagnetic stimulation, where you can use electrical pulses to temporarily dampen down a particular area of the brain. They found with that the cerebellum, which is the area low down right at the back of the head, an amazing area, because it contains half our brain cells, but is only 10% of the brain's volume, and it coordinates movement for us. And they found that if they dampen down that area, then we actually get worse at estimating milliseconds, but we're still fine at seconds. So it does seem as though different areas are involved with these different durations, and that seems to be a really key thing.
Well, and of course, as with every other neurological study I think I've ever read, dopamine is also mentioned.
Yes, that's right. I mean, dopamine is definitely has something to do with it, and there's this area, the basal ganglia, and these are the areas deep inside the middle of the head, and amazingly, it was only discovered in 2001 that these had anything to do with time perception, and they loop around in a curve, a bit like a sort of hearing aid might, down deep inside the head, and they help to control dopamine. We know that a drug that's often used for people with schizophrenia blocks dopamine, and people will then underestimate the time that's passed. Amazingly, children who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder will actually feel time as slower, and dopamine seems to be implicated there, and they will actually feel time as passing slowly. And research done here in London at the Institute of Psychiatry has found that by doing tests of time perception on children, just getting them to guess the amount of time passing, they can actually correctly identify 70% of cases of ADHD that have been diagnosed in other ways. And so some of these disorders that we talk about might actually almost be disorders of time perception. And we know that people who are depressed feel that time is passing twice as slowly as other people. People with schizophrenia will talk about time feeling very disrupted, and almost sometimes people will describe time feeling as if it's going backwards or forwards, and there seems to be something to do with time perception that's disrupted there, and that can be very disconcerting for people.
Well, we're talking a lot about the different feelings around time, but different people actually visualize time differently as well.
Yes, this is really interesting. So 1 in 5 people will actually visualize time laid out in some way before them. So whenever they think about, say, the months of the year, and somebody says, oh, can you do something in March, they might see it in a particular place in space in front of them. So I do this, and so I imagine very much that the year is like an oval, and it goes anti-clockwise with January at the top, and it goes round, but it goes anti-clockwise, not clockwise. And so I can see where I think March is, and I can see where I think August is, and whenever those things are mentioned, I'll imagine those at that time. And 1 in 5 people do this, and they see them in all sorts of different ways. And some people call this time-space synesthesia and think it's actually a form of synesthesia where different senses, the messages from different senses seem to get crossed over, and they get crossed over with each other. And people will do this, and people describe to me extraordinary things. People sent me all the things that they saw, and people would describe, that they saw the sentries laid out on a wallpaper pasting table, and then the main sentry we're on now would be on the flat, and then there'd be these rolls of wallpaper going off the side, and that would be all the sentries going back, and they'd see all the appropriate kings and queens in the right place, and the Romans and the ancient Egyptians. And people have these amazingly vivid things that they see. One person saw time as the months and the days as like a slinky of time, and you could say, oh, well, aren't people just making this up? But, how do we know that that's really that comes to mind when those things come up? But you can test this in a lab. So if you've got a very straightforward picture of how someone sees the months of the year in a circle, then you can set them up on a computer. You can have it so that if the answer to the question, say, that they're being asked is March, and that's on the left-hand side of the computer, and that's where they see it, they will answer that faster, and they can press the button faster if it fits in. So that gives you and you can measure how long that takes. So that gives you a way of quantifying whether what they're saying they see is what they're actually seeing. But there is an extent, I think, to which we all see time and space. So if you give people some flashcards, and one says past on it, one says present, and one says future, and ask them to lay them out in a way that makes sense. Most people who speak English or who speak languages that are written from left to right will put the past on the left and the present in the middle and the future on the right, a bit like the way a book goes. If you do it with people who speak Mandarin Chinese, they will put them vertically instead, and they will look up for the past and down for the future. And so there is a sense in which we all associate time with space.
You say that the ability to picture time and space is particularly important in helping us create our own perception of time.
That's right, and I think is a useful thing for people. And they've even done experiments where people who have very strong pictures of this have improved memory for when events are happening. And in a way, if you see time in a way, then you should have a wall planner that looks like that and looks like your picture, and not one just done in squares that you might buy, because it will help you to remember that better. And they've done tests where people have to manipulate the months, for example. So if you get people to count backwards from November 3 months at a time, it's a task you have to think about a little to do it. But the people who see time laid out will do it very quickly, because they can just see this. A bit like people who visualize numbers laid out can often do sums using those number lines. In a sense, it can be an advantage to people.
This is Science for the People, and I'll be back with Claudia Hammond, author of Time Warped, after this.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show exploring everyday life from a scientific perspective. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+, or to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and my guest today is Claudia Hammond, psychologist and presenter of All in the Mind and Mind Changers on BBC Radio 4. We're talking about her book, Time Warped, Unlocking the Mysteries of Time Perception. Now, something that you did in your book that I found very interesting is you definitely make the distinction between how we see the passing of time prospectively and how we see it retrospectively.
We do look at time in these two different ways. And so when we look at it prospectively, it's like saying, how fast is time going right now? You know, am I bored? Am I interested? Is this going fast? Is this going slowly? And then we look back afterwards and we say, what did that event feel like? Did it feel fast or did it feel slow? And this is why we get this really strange thing that happens when you go on holiday, which I refer to as the holiday paradox, which is that a good holiday will often go too fast, and you do all sorts of exciting things, and say if you're away for a week, in no time at all you're halfway through the week and you're thinking about going home again and how to get back to the airport, and it all seems to have gone a bit too quickly because it's been so interesting. But when you get home, it suddenly seems as if you've been away for longer than that. And although the holiday went really fast, it now feels as if you've been away for ages. And the same thing happens if you just go away for a weekend, and it will feel longer than a weekend where you didn't go away. And it will feel as if you haven't been at work for a while. And the reason for this is because of these two ways that we look at time, prospectively and retrospectively. And so when you look at time prospectively on holiday, it's how's this going right now, or it's really fun and it's all going really fast. When you look back, we use how many new memories we've made to estimate how much time has passed. So on holiday, you do loads of new things, and you might go and see 8 different, completely new things and have 8 new experiences just in one day. Whereas in everyday life, it becomes more repetitive and more routine, particularly as you get older and you live in the same place for longer and you go and do the same things for longer. So you make fewer memories, and it doesn't feel as if as much time has passed. And then it suddenly comes as a bit of a shock when you see some marker in time and realize it has. Like I'm 42 and I keep seeing things that I own in vintage shops, and this doesn't seem right to me because I think, but this is a perfectly normal bag. I have this bag. How can this be counted as vintage? And then I remember that I'm not 20 anymore, but it doesn't quite feel like that. So, and this is because we look at time in these two ways, and then that causes this strange mismatch for us that feels so uncomfortable. It makes you feel as if time is speeding up.
So it's almost cognitive dissonance at that point.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So we have these two views, and often they match, and it's fine when they match, and that seems normal. And it's when they don't match that we remark on it, and that you say, "Oh, that's weird. It feels as if we've been away for ages. How weird is that?" And you'll hear people comment on that to each other. Most of the time, they fit in together, so we don't even notice. But then you get this strange mismatch. So with aging, and so life gets more routine. You start doing the same things again and again. You make fewer new memories, and then you don't think much time has passed, and then suddenly you get this shock because you realize it has.
Well, and that's one of the things I found so interesting about your book is you spend a lot of time talking about the different theories around why time seems like it speeds up as we age.
Yeah, so one of the most common ones people will say, if you discuss this with people will say, I know the reason, I know what it is. It's all about proportionality. And this was a theory that the philosopher Paul Janet first suggested in the 19th century, and others like the writer Vladimir Nabokov and people have talked about it since. And the idea is that a year when you're 8 is only an eighth of your life, and a year when you're 40 is a 40th of your life, so no wonder life seems slower when you were 8. In a sense, I think this is just a description of what's happening rather than an explanation, because in studies, people don't think that individual days are going faster. They think that the months and the years and possibly the weeks are going faster, but not the individual days. Those still feel to people as if they're going at a normal speed, which is probably a good job, because if you were going to live till 80, say, then a single day at the age of 40 would be 1/14,000th of your life. So that should feel as if it flashes by. And it doesn't. It seems to go at a normal speed. And also, if that theory did hold and you were going to live till 80, then you'd have lived half of your subjective life by the age of 20, which would be a pity. So we don't really want it to be true. And so I think it is just a description of what's happening rather than an explanation.
So now, how does one research this? Are we looking at other studies that sort of touch on this, or can we research this specific question?
in a way, it's difficult to research. So you can do things like you can get people to estimate how fast they think a day is going. You can do surveys where you just ask people if they think that time seems to be going faster now than it was. And interestingly, when you do those, it's people in middle age and late middle age who think that time is going really fast. And people, once they're, say, in their late 70s and 80s, don't say it's going so fast again. It's almost as if it slows down again at that time. And so it's not that it just gets faster and faster in some straight line, proportional way. There are also studies looking at, say, the phenomenon of telescoping, and so this is when you think events happened, and we have a tendency to telescope time, and so everyone will have had that experience of being amazed to discover that it's the 20th anniversary of something you remember really well, and this just seems extraordinary. And I mean, over here there was today, it's the 30th anniversary, they were saying, of compilation records that used to come out called Now That's What I Call Music, and I bought the first one of those, number one, and they're now on number goodness knows what. But it's 30 years ago that the first one came out, and I find that absolutely unbelievable that could possibly have been 30 years ago. And I would have guessed it was much more recent than that. And so this is called telescoping, and so people will think that a news event perhaps happened, they'll say it happened 4 years ago, and really it was 6 years ago. And so there are experiments about that which slightly show you how we're skewing time. And what's really interesting about those is that there seems to be this cutoff of 3 years, particularly for public sort of news events. So if you think something happened 3 years ago, people are quite good at guessing that. If you think something happened 5 years ago, then the chances are really it was 6 or 7 years ago. If you think it happened 10 years ago, it was probably 12 years ago. But older people don't do it so much, which could be that they've got used to it and they compensate, and they've noticed for so long that they do this that they adjust for it when they add up their sums. Or is it that it's not happening so much by then? Is it something that only seems to happen so much in middle age?
Well, there's one more concept I really wanted to touch on. And it's potentially problematic. You say in your book that the evidence is starting to mount around the idea that our minds are actually skewed towards thinking about the future. So what makes you say that?
So there's been interesting work showing that we spend an enormous amount of time thinking about the future, and that when the brain is at rest, there almost might be a default for us to think about the future. And if you put people in a brain scanner and get them to think about nothing, which is always hard, and the brain is supposedly at rest, the areas associated with thinking about the future will begin to become active. And it's almost as if this is the thing we need to do, is to keep thinking about the future, because that is the thing that might help us survive, and the thing that made people make plans and think ahead. And it doesn't seem to be the case that any other animal can put themselves into the future, can mentally time travel in exactly the same way that we can. So some creatures like scrub jays, for example, very clever birds, will hide their food, they cache their food, and if another bird sees them hiding it, they'll move it to somewhere else while the other bird isn't looking, which is quite a clever, involved thing to do, and might suggest that they're planning for the future. But this is different from being able to mentally put yourself in a position in the future and imagine that you're doing that, and which is what's known as future thinking. And interestingly, patients who've got amnesia aren't able to do that either. It does seem to be very much related to memory. And if you ask 3-year-olds, for example, whose memories aren't very developed, if they can suggest what they'll do next day, a third of them can't suggest anything plausible that they might do the next day, when what they're probably going to do is the same as they did this day. But they can't think what they might do tomorrow. They almost don't have a sense of a plausible future like that.
Well, since you mentioned that, I have to ask about the marshmallow study.
Yes. I mean, the marshmallow study is so sweet. There's lots of videos online on YouTube of the marshmallow study where you can watch it. And so this was a study done by Walter Mischel decades ago now. He took these 4 and 5-year-olds, and they come into a room, and on a plate there's a marshmallow, and they're told they can either have that one marshmallow right away, and that the experimenter's got to go away for a moment, but that if they wait for the experimenter to come back again, they can have 2 marshmallows instead. And it's really interesting watching the videos of children deciding what to do, and you can see them trying to sit on their hands hands and trying not to look at it because they're told to sit on the chair and stay on the chair, and desperately trying not to have it. Some will just lick it on the plate and sniff it and smell it, and you can see they so desperately want it. Some of them will just eat it straight away and they don't care that they won't get the second one. Others will wait, and it's amazing how they do wait. And he followed up to people for years and years and years, decades, and he found that it didn't happen in every single case, but more of the people who waited were successful later on, and more of the people who didn't wait got into various difficulties later on, might be more likely to have ended up in prison or more likely to be unemployed. Of course, it didn't happen with every case, and so he always cautions that parents shouldn't just go around testing their kids on this to see what happens and then be convinced that they're going to be doomed forever because they couldn't wait for a second marshmallow. That's not the case. And in a sense, this is a sort of measure of their impulsivity, and it's also a measure of how they deal with time and how time feels to them, whether they can deal with waiting for this time. And Walter Mischel has tried to teach, he's looked at the strategies that the children who are successful at this use, and they will do things like not concentrate on the loveliness and the soft, squudgy pinkness of the marshmallow. They will concentrate on colder aspects of it, if you like, instead, and just look at the plate and think about other things. And they're using strategies to distract themselves from that time, which is a really clever thing to do. And he's trying to work out if he could teach other kids to do that. And if you did, you could teach them to be less impulsive.
You're listening to Science for the People, and I'm joined by Claudia Hammond, who presents All in the Mind and Mind Changers on BBC Radio 4, and she's the author of Time Warped. Children are horrible at this, obviously, but adults aren't much better in a lot of ways, because if future thinking is kind of our default, isn't that potentially problematic, mostly because we are spectacularly bad about thinking objectively about our own futures?
Oh, we're really bad at it, yes. We're very bad at guessing what will happen, and there's a finding called the impact bias, which is that we're very bad, in particular, at guessing how we'll feel about things emotionally in the future, and we tend to focus on the first features of an event that will happen in the future and the main features of it, and to ignore all the other things. So if someone gets a new job, a job they really want, a promotion they really want, people will wildly overestimate how happy this will make them. The initial happiness of it will wear off, usually after a few months, and people don't take into account things like they're still going to have the same journey to work that annoyed them all the time anyway. And they don't take those other things into account. They just look at the chief feature of this will be my new job and this will all be marvellous. The good news is that this happens with bad things too. So people overestimate the impact of a bad thing happening to them, that it will be very bad at first, and that we do get used to things in an amazing way. And so they've done studies with people who have, say, suffered some kind of injury that now causes them to have quite a severe disability. And they will find that people will, over time, become more accustomed to that than you think, and that people's happiness levels over the long time might dip a bit, but not as much as they might expect at the beginning. And so we overestimate how much we will react emotionally to things in the future. So we're not very good at thinking about the future, and we're very bad at guessing how long things will take us in the future, and of planning our time in the future, because we have this, it's rather sweet, we kind of think that in the future we'll be more organised, better versions of ourselves, and sadly that's probably not the case.
Would you care to speculate at all as to why that is? Why do our brains work that way?
I think that most people have a bias a bit towards optimism, and that's a useful thing and encourages us to try out lots of new things and to be enthusiastic and to think that these things might work, and that often they will work. But we are also optimistic about how much time we'll have in the future. And so we think that we'll, one, be more organised, and that we'll have all this spare time. And so this leads to the famous planning fallacy, and the government procurement projects are blighted by this, that something that's supposed to take a year always ends up as a massive overspend and taking 2 years instead, and we all do it in our own lives. So we think that we can build ourselves a new kitchen in a weekend, and it's just not very likely at all. But the one good thing that comes out of the research from this that we can use is that we're really good at guessing how long someone else will take to do something. So they did one study where they got people doing their PhDs to estimate when they'd finish them, and they also got them to estimate when they thought their friends would finish theirs. And they estimated their friends' ones very accurately, because they took into account all the things that could go wrong, like, you're bound to be ill at some point, or there's water coming through the ceiling, or some people come up and visit unexpectedly, all these things that distract you from your work. And they didn't take those into account for themselves. For themselves, they just thought it would all go perfectly, but they realized it wouldn't for others. So the lesson from that is, if you're trying to guess how long it will take you to build your kitchen, tell someone else about it and ask them, and they will come up with a more accurate answer than you.
This really supports the idea of the wisdom of crowds.
Yes, it does, because you could ask lots of other people and they will come up with a better answer than you will yourself, because we're just too optimistic about ourselves, and sometimes that's a good thing for us, but if we're trying to guess how long something takes, then it never is.
Well, you named your last section of the book Changing Your Relationship with Time. So why might we want to do that?
We might want to do that if we're troubled by the fact that time seems to go too fast, or if you're troubled by the fact that you never have enough time because you agree to do too many things and you take all these things on, and because of the planning fallacy you think you'll do them all really fast when you won't. And so lots of people will say to me, oh, time, you're writing about time, that's interesting because I'm really troubled by time, it's something that troubles me. If it doesn't trouble people, then that's fine, but the biggest one people talk about is time going too fast. And in a sense, if you look at all the research on why time slows down, they're not very good things. So time will go more slowly if people are feeling rejected, if people are feeling depressed, if people are feeling lonely. If time seems to be going fast for you, then that might be a sign that none of those things are going on, and that you've got a really busy life and that all these things are crammed into it. So it seems like it's going too fast and there's all too much, but that might not be such a bad thing after all. You might not, it's kind of be careful what you wish for. You might not want the opposite of time dragging instead. But you can use things like this idea of the holiday paradox to make the time seem as if it lasts a bit longer. So if you're going away, so if you deliberately decide to fill your weekend with lots of different new events, you deliberately make new memories. When you get to the end of that weekend, you'll look at it retrospectively and you will think that the weekend has taken longer than it has. Now, obviously, you've got to trade rest for doing all these things, and you might just want to laze around for a weekend and rest, but then the weekend will feel as if it's gone faster. So it kind of depends on whether it bothers you or not, and whether it's worth doing that instead.
Well, you've given us a lot of advice in the book for different sort of scenarios, but I found really interesting the advice you gave for being in the present.
Yeah, so one thing people will often say is that they find it very difficult to remain in the present at all, and there are our minds veering off towards the future all the time and veering back to our memories, and it is hard to enjoy the present of what's going on. You can be in the most amazing, idyllic place on holiday, and you're still thinking, what are you going to do tomorrow, and what are you going to eat tonight, and what are you going to do, and you're thinking, no, but I should be enjoying this moment right now. And one of the ways that people have found is useful for that is by learning the techniques of mindfulness, which are to be mindful and notice what exactly is going on around you, how all your different senses feel at any different moment, what you can see, what you can feel, what the texture of the seat is. All these different sort of things will bring you back into the present. And so people will find that learning mindfulness makes a difference. And even things like taking a slightly different walk to work, if you can walk, one street back from the street you normally walk up, or get off the bus or stop early and walk, all those things will create new memories and make the time feel as if it's been a bit longer, but also make you notice what's happening in the present more. And just looking up at the buildings. I was just walking into work a bit earlier and bumped into a friend of mine, and she suddenly looked up and sort of said, I've never seen those two statues off the top of that building before. Have you noticed those? This is a road I've walked up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and I hadn't noticed those before. But looking up and you see something different, you make new memories, it slightly changes your relationship with time.
Well, and I mentioned earlier, a lot of these studies seem almost more like philosophy than they do science sometimes, but occasionally, and this is one example, this is a very Buddhist idea that you're talking about, but there is evidence to back up that there is value to this.
Yes, there is, and there's been some interesting work done at Oxford University, actually using training mindfulness, actually training people in mindfulness, people who've had depression that's been hard to treat. And they have had some success with it, with depression, when people have learnt it specifically for that purpose, that it does seem to help them to focus and help them to focus on the present and help them to feel happier. So there is good evidence behind it, and there have been trials done, which is encouraging.
Well, any last pieces of advice for those who are having a problem with their relationship with time?
I think if you think you do too many things, then one of the things you can do is to imagine when somebody asks you to do something in a few months' time that it's next week instead. And would you say yes to that thing if it was next week? And if you wouldn't, then what is it that's going to be different about a few months' time that means you've got the time to do that? So people will say to me, can you come and give a talk in Edinburgh next week? And I know I can't possibly because I'm too busy. If they say to me, can you come and give a talk in Edinburgh in February? I quite often say yes, and it's 4 hours, 5 hours on the train. I'd need to stay overnight. When it comes around to February, I'm thinking, I haven't got time to do this. Why did I agree to do this? What am I going to do? And if I just thought about it as next week, I know that can't possibly be fitted in unless I'm going to do something to make a change, to make there be time for it. And so one of the things is just to sometimes say no to doing things.
That's fantastic advice. Claudia, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And we've linked to Claudia Hammond and her book, Time Warped, on our site at scienceforthepeople.ca. And we'll be back with more Science for the People after this.
Once again, Science for the People helps you with your holiday shopping by looking at some of the best books for the science lover on your list. We'll hear from some of our favorite past guests and members of the Science for the People team as they share their most treasured science books from 2013, as well as classics to help fill out anyone's science library. And physicist and author Aaron Santos joins us to run some fascinating holiday-themed Fermi equations. That's next week on Science for the People, on your local radio station, or online at scienceforthepeople.ca.
Hello and welcome to Science for the People. I'm Rachelle Saunders. I'm here with Ethan Siegel, theoretical astrophysicist and professor at the University of Portland and Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. He has previously taught at the University of Wisconsin and done astrophysics research at the University of Arizona. He currently writes the blog Starts With a Bang on the Science Blogs Network, which dives headlong into all things astrophysical on a nearly daily basis. Great to have you back to the show, Ethan.
Thank you, Rachelle. It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I have been a longtime fan of Doctor Who, and time travel looks really, really cool. But of course, is it actually possible?
Well, if you're asking that, first off, you've got to recognize we only have perspective inside our universe, and I can only assume that just like the TARDIS, the universe is bigger on the inside. In fact, it seems vast and, as far as we can tell, infinite to us. But when you talk about being in this universe, we're not just existing in this universe at one moment in space. We exist caught up in the flow of time. We exist always moving forward through time. And we move forward through time at a very specific rate. That rate happens to be 1 second per second. And that doesn't sound like a very interesting thing, but we only have one dimension of time. If we didn't have that, if we weren't moving through time, nothing would ever change. We would live in a completely static universe, and as far as our perceptions go, we'd never be able to perceive anything. So time travel, in the basic sense of time travel, isn't just possible, it's inevitable, and without it, we wouldn't have experiences in this universe to talk about.
So in short, we are currently all time travelers.
We are all time travelers, whether we like it or not.
Okay, so let's talk about the exciting version of time travel outside of the everyday. And I want to start by breaking this into a couple of parts because I know there's a few different areas here. So let's start with time travel into the future at a faster than 1 second per 1 second rate. Possible?
It's totally possible. In fact, we've done this both for subatomic particles and with less pronounced effects to human beings. So you can, just by moving relative to any rest frame, time travel into the future at a faster rate than someone who's stationary.
So how does that work exactly?
The way that works, so this is where Einstein's special relativity comes in. Anyone who for themselves is stationary, is in what we call a non-accelerating frame of reference, is going to feel time passing for them at a very specific rate, that rate of 1 second per second. That's just based on how the speed of light is the same in all reference frames and how light basically defines the second by how far light moves in a given amount of time. So for everyone, that passes at the same rate. The thing is, if you're moving relative to me, if you're moving very quickly, when I watch you in your spaceship or train or whatever it is that's moving quickly, I see your little beam of light moving at the speed of light. But I also see, since you're moving very quickly, I see that your light, in order to bounce down to, say, one end of a clock, bounce up, if that's how you make your clock, because you're moving quickly, say horizontally, if your clock is moving vertically, I'm going to see that, wow, that takes longer than it would for my clock to just move up and down because it's not moving horizontally. So I see your clock moving slower. And what that means is for you, when you go on your journey and come back and return to my frame of reference, you're going to see, wow, Ethan is way older than I am. For Ethan, time has passed more quickly than it has for me. So that's how Einstein's relativity tells us if anything moves relative to another object and then comes back to that same non-moving object's reference frame, it's going to find that more time has passed back home. And because you've been out on your journey traveling through space, less time has passed for you.
That's actually kind of counterintuitive, and one of the most interesting things I think about relativity, because you really think that time ought to be the constant there. But because the speed of light is constant, that means time has to be kind of flexible.
That's absolutely right. And it's sort of counterintuitive is the right word, because what's happening is it's not that the speed of light is going to change or anything like that. No, the speed of light is that constant thing. So if you're moving at 99% the speed of light relative to me, when you look at me, I'm moving at 99% the speed of light relative to you. You're going to see my clock moving slowly. I'm going to see your clock moving slowly. The only way we resolve this paradox, the only way we resolve, okay, who's going to be older when we meet up again, is that's going to depend on whose frame of reference we wind up in. If you're moving at 99% the speed of light in one direction and I'm moving at 99% the speed of light in the other direction, where are we going to meet up? If you stay moving constant, if you don't accelerate, and I go and I meet you, I'm going to be the young one and you're the one who'll have aged. But if we do it the other way, if you go and you accelerate to come meet me, I'm going to be the one who's older and you're going to be the one who's aged less. So you think about this as the speed of light, that's the constant, but you can move through space or time as that happens. So it's always a combination of the two. If you don't move through space at all, if you stay stationary in space, time is going to pass maximally for you. So you will age the fastest. Whereas if you're moving through space very rapidly, that means that time is going to pass less quickly for you as it will for someone who's stationary.
I kind of love how relativity breaks my brain.
It does a little bit for me too, and I always have to think back to the equations for how it works to make sense of it. But I'm happy that we can talk about it without equations, because I think relativity, even though it's not intuitive to everyone, it affects everyone, and we all have to live with its consequences. So I think we should make it as accessible to as many people as possible.
Okay, so back to time travel. So we've established that it is possible to go faster than 1 second per 1 second, sorta, and to go into somebody else's future, I guess, let's say. But what's the ratio here? Is it substantially in the future? How fast do I have to go to get more than, I don't know, a couple of microseconds into the future?
So the microseconds is a really good example, because if you are a, fighter pilot in a stealth aircraft, maybe you're in the Blackbird spy plane that's been retired, but whatever the replacement for that is, I'm sure it's a secret. But if you're in that and you go up, to some high altitude of 100,000 feet and you're zipping around at Mach 5 and you come back down to Earth, you're going to find that your watch and my watch, because I've been on Earth the whole time, when we sync back up, you're going to find that your watch is, like you say, probably a few milliseconds slower than mine. A little bit less time will have passed for you. Now, if you look at something like astronauts, like the Apollo astronauts, astronauts who've gone up and orbited the moon and come back, their clocks are actually going to be slower by a few seconds. So they've been up for a few days, it's going to be slower by a few seconds. Now, we've never accelerated a living thing like a human being close to the speed of light. The fastest we've ever come is still just a fraction of a percent of the speed of light. But we have accelerated things like muons, which are unstable particles close to the speed of light. And what we find for them is a muon, a normal muon, only has a lifetime of about 2.2 microseconds. If you have a muon that isn't moving close to the speed of light, that's how long it's going to live. And if you say, well, if my muon is moving at, if it were moving at the speed of light and there were no relativity, how far could it go in 2.2 microseconds? And the answer is, it's kind of far, right? The speed of light is 300,000 kilometers per second. So it can travel maybe, almost a half a mile. It's pretty far. But what we see is we have muons that are created in the upper atmosphere from cosmic rays, from things like protons coming from the sun. They interact with the Earth's upper atmosphere. They produce muons. You're producing muons 100 kilometers off the ground. And remember, these muons, if it's not for relativity, are only going to survive for less than a mile, for less than a kilometer. So you make them 100 miles up, and if you hold out your hand right now, you can totally not see me doing this. When you hold out your hand right now, perpendicular to the surface of the Earth, what's happening is you're getting about 1 muon passing through your hand every second. And that's all coming from cosmic rays.
I was doing that as well.
Okay, great.
Now
that's what's happening is they're moving close to the speed of light, and it's that time dilation. It's that fact that they're moving very quickly relative to the rest frame of you that allows them to survive that long, that allows them to survive not for 2.2 microseconds, but for significantly longer than that because of relativity.
So now this kind of time travel actually happens on a day-to-day basis. I'm thinking GPS.
GPS satellites are a great example, and that brings in another type of relativity, which is general relativity, because it's not only your motion through space that determines how fast time passes, it's also your location in a gravitational field that determines how fast time passes. So we're here on the surface of the Earth, and you know that our gravitational field here is pretty strong, as evidenced by the fact that even if you jump as hard as you possibly can, and you're good at it, you'll get maybe a few feet off the ground. But if you wanted to overcome the Earth's gravitational pull, you'd have to get, thousands of miles off the ground. You would take a tremendous amount of energy. So when we have GPS satellites up there, they're orbiting at a larger distance from Earth. They're much higher up, and they're in a much weaker gravitational field than we are. So if we want to accurately pinpoint something's position by sending a signal up out of our gravitational field to this satellite that's both fast moving and in a different gravitational field, we have to account for both of those effects. The earliest GPS attempts were typically off by something like maybe about 100 feet, because they didn't take that into account. So you need to take into account both special relativity, which is how fast you're moving, and also general relativity, which is where you are in a gravitational field, to understand how you're traveling through time.
From a practical sense, from a I want my TARDIS now sense, what's the energy cost for potentially moving something like a one-person spaceship fast enough that it would actually get me to the future?
Well, so right now we're stuck with what we call conventional fuel sources, right? That's how we accelerate big things. We're not yet comfortable doing things like strapping ourselves onto a nuclear reactor-powered rocket. When you talk about, I want to accelerate something like a one-person spacecraft as fast as I can, well, the best technology we have now is to take a giant rocket it, fill it with nothing but fuel, and try to accelerate that little tiny bit that's going to have a spacecraft with a person inside of it. And we can get those speeds up to about 40,000 miles per hour. But 40,000 miles per hour is still way short of the speed of light. If you want to know how much energy it would take to send something human size close to the speed of light, well, we can go to Einstein's E equals mc squared, right? If you want to get something moving close to the speed of light, you need to give it at least about 10 times as much kinetic energy as there is your energy in mass. So if you take your mass, right, that's your m, you multiply it by c squared, and remember the speed of light is about 300,000 kilometers per second. That's pretty fast. It's a big number. The E you need, the energy, if you want it to be some large number times your mass times the speed of light squared, you're talking a tremendous amount of energy. For something like a human to get it close to the speed of light, you're basically saying, I want to take the energy of all the nuclear power plants, all the coal power plants, all the power plants on the entire surface of the Earth, and use about that much power to accelerate me. So we're talking a lot of energy, way more than we practically know how to create at this point in time without resorting to something like flying into the sun.
Okay, I'm putting flying into the sun on my to-do list. Hypothetically, we've made it to the future now.
That's right.
The next step is, can we come back to, I guess, what would be our present?
Now you have to start looking at other options, because Einstein's relativity is a one-way street. You know, in most things, when you're traveling through space-time, all you can really do is change how fast you move through it, but you only move in one direction. You're always moving forward through time. The only hope you have, as long as, we accept that general relativity is the only way to go, the only hope you have of moving back in time is to somehow make a defect in your space-time to create what we call a closed time-like loop. This is where some part of space-time, some path through space-time will actually loop back in on itself and put you out somewhere back in the past, back where you started from. So far, we have not yet figured out a way to practically do that. But in theory, it's possible if we could curve one region of space-time significantly enough to loop back on itself and somehow pass an object through it without destroying it. That's what it would take to go back in time.
You're tuned in to Science for the People, and I'm here with Ethan Siegel, theoretical astrophysicist, and we're pondering the possibilities and scientific realities of time travel. Okay, so time travel to the past sounds kind of hard, but there is some theory that supports that it is possible. And you were mentioning folding space-time. That sounds a little bit like hypothetical warp drive stuff.
So there's two separate things that are both related to folding space-time. One is, if you think of space, okay, space is three-dimensional, but because we're very limited, I'm going to ask you to just imagine two dimensions of it, sort of like a map. Imagine a two-dimensional sheet of space. Now imagine you could take that space and you could fold it in on itself, right? So you could take, something like, if you took a map of Earth, you could in theory take something like Florida and Beijing and just scrunch them together. And if you could poke a hole through that, you could go straight from Florida to Beijing almost instantly. So that's what the warp drive idea is that we're going to compress space so that we can travel through it very quickly. And that's one way of curving space-time dramatically. Now, in reality, the gravitational fields that it would take to curve space-time that much are so dramatic that the very atoms or even the atomic nuclei themselves would be ripped apart if they were brought even close to space-time that was curved that much. But just like we use the word space-time, you can imagine it isn't just space that can fold or compress, but maybe the time dimension as well, so that you could imagine entering some of this folded space-time at one moment in time and exiting it at a moment that could be well into the past. And that's the theory of how you would travel back in time by folding space-time.
Ethan, thank you so much for being here on the show, as always. Thanks for coming back.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you want to learn more about Ethan Siegel or the latest in astrophysics research and theory, you can visit his blog at scienceblogs.com/startswithabang, a link you'll be able to find in the show notes at our website, scienceforthepeople.ca. And while you're visiting our website and clicking links, please do keep clicking on over to our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, and our Google Plus page, where you can keep up with the latest news from the Science for the People team. You can also click on over to us on iTunes, where you can listen to past episodes and subscribe to the show. It would also delight us if you take a minute or two to leave a review. Thanks, and I'll see you next time on Science for the People.
Science for the People is recorded in Edmonton, Alberta. The show is produced by Rachelle Saunders. Ryan Bromsgrove is our promotions manager. Our social media manager is Chelsea Butler. K.O. Myers updates our website. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. Ed Haynes is our guest coordinator. We get research help from Josh Witten. The show is edited by K.O. Myers and Ryan Bromsgrove. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. The show is hosted by Rachelle Saunders, Marie Claire Shanahan, and me, Desiree Schell.